So today we are starting with the new chapter, which is chapter 9, and this is also going to be the beginning of outcome 2 from unit 2 for us. So essentially what chapter 9 is all about is, like, so far in psychology what we've done is we've just looked at like the biological side of things. We've looked at like the cognitive side of things, looking at how we think. And so a lot of our focus has been on biological psychology, cognitive psychology. We haven't really focused much on social psychology at all. And so this chapter is the beginning of basically the entire outcome, which is all about basically social psychology and personality psychology. Okay, so that's basically what we are beginning today. And what we are trying to get through today is basically understanding what is this concept of social cognition, and then basically also trying to understand what are the different components or the aspects of social cognition. Now, there are 3 of them, and we're only going to actually go through one of them today. And the main thing we're going to go through today is looking at this concept of person perception. Okay, and person perception is how we make impressions or judgments of other people, how we basically perceive and make sense of other people. So before we look at that, we have to understand and we have to define what do we mean by social cognition. So social cognition is essentially how we analyze and use information to make judgments about other people in our social environment who are in different social situations. So in this definition, it's really important for you to remember that there are 2 key phrases here. The first one is how you analyze and use information, okay? Because there's no point if we're analyzing someone and we're not actually using that information to make a judgment. If I'm just looking at someone and noticing that they're a little bit like lacking in confidence, and I'm not using that to actually make a judgment or to actually make a change or to help them to become more confident, well, then it's really not going to be of much use or benefit there. So social cognition is not just about blindly making judgments about others, but about using that information to make those judgments. So those judgments are always informed in nature. Okay, when we analyze a person and then we decide to make a judgment, we will be less likely to make assumptions about who that person is, or we're less likely to make assumptions about their personality. Okay, so we have to really analyze a person quite well before we can make a judgment of who they are. Okay, so for example, if you call your friend and then they don't pick up, and let's say they forget to call you back, you can't just automatically say that, okay, they're a bad person. Okay, they might have had a lot going on, or they might have had, they might have just, the notification for your missed call might not have come up on their phone, or maybe their phone is playing up. Okay, so obviously if that behavior though occurs continuously over time, and it's something that you always notice with that person, you would then analyze and use that information that, okay, my friend is always kind of dodging my phone calls, they're not really getting back to me, or like, getting back in touch with me. Then you could use that information to make an informed judgment about this person being a little bit being a little bit ignorant of your friendship, or maybe being a bit neglectful with reference to your friendship and that social connection you guys have. Okay, so social cognition is just 2 things. It's about how we analyze people, and we use that information that we analyze about people, regardless of who that person is, and you're basically using that to make judgments about who they are. And remember, it could be the same person, but 2 different people might have a different social judgment of that person. Okay, and that depends, of course, on, so let's say Lisa and Katie have a best friend called Tina, and Lisa has a different judgment of Tina compared to Katie. Okay, because maybe Katie acts a little bit differently with Tina as compared to the other girls. So essentially what kind of relationships we have with others is dependent on the social judgments that we make. And the social judgments that we make are referred to as social cognition. Okay, remember, cognition comes from the word think. Okay, comes from the word cognitive or cognition, which is basically to think. So social cognition is about how we think about others in our social environment and how we use those information and those observations to make judgments about them. Alrighty, so that is social cognition, and that is a very key definition we need to know. Now, what are the effects of social cognition, or what's the purpose, in other words, of social cognition? Okay, we know that social cognition is important for us, but what is the point? So this slide is kind of just looking at what is the purpose of having social cognition, or of demonstrating social cognition. Essentially, what is the point? The first important thing about why we need to engage in social cognition is that our social judgments are integral to the kind of, sorry, there should be a question mark, are integral to the kind of relationships that we form with others. Okay, now as humans, we're not perfect, so sometimes our social judgments can be inaccurate. Okay, but let's talk about firstly what happens when our social judgments are accurate. Okay, if you've got a friend, let's just use the previous example before. If you've got a friend who you continuously try to get in contact with, you message them, you call them, but you're always the one doing most of the work, and they're not contributing much, that's going to be a problem. And you might start to realize that, you know what, maybe this person doesn't value this friendship in the same way that I do. And that social judgment that you make, that yes, they don't value the friendship in the same way you do, might be accurate. And if it is accurate, then it's going to be beneficial for your social well-being to maybe kind of distance yourself from that person so you don't get hurt, or to maybe not put like 110% into that relationship when they're not putting much in there. So sometimes our social judgments are accurate and they are true to nature, and they can be beneficial for our social well-being and our social development. On the other hand, and this is the more problematic one, sometimes our social judgments of other people can be inaccurate or flawed. And this is where a lot of misunderstandings can arise. Okay, sometimes if, for example, you have a friend who's actually a really nice person and who's always looking out for you, and one day, you know, something of yours goes missing, let's say some belonging, and then you start to maybe suspect that they've taken it without your permission, and then you confront them about it. And then maybe, you know, maybe they are so offended that that actually leads to the breakdown of your friendship. Okay, so sometimes our social judgments of people can be inaccurate or flawed, and a lot of the time this tends to happen when we don't make social judgments that are informed. So when we base our judgments on things like suspicion, on like misinformed concepts, or, you know, ill judgments that are not actually based on actual truth or actual substantiated claims, essentially. Okay, so this can obviously then be negative for our well-being. On the other hand, or if you look at the other side of the coin, if someone is getting into a relationship with another person, and that person is very rude, very very inconsiderate, but because obviously they're in love and love is blind, they don't really pay attention to the negative characteristics. And only later down the track, they realize that this person was actually a really bad person. And I never realized, well, that could have been potentially negative for their social well-being, because all this time they were with a person who was putting them down, was making them feel bad, and essentially really kind of stunted their social development and their social well-being there. Okay, by not giving them that stable and safe and secure relationship. So again, depending on, social cognition is important, because depending on what kind of judgment you make, you can either end up getting into a really good friendship or relationship or social connection with someone, which is really beneficial for your social well-being, or you can end up getting into a relationship that is very negative for your well-being. For example, getting into an abusive relationship, or you might end up losing a friend or losing a loved one because you've misunderstood them and you've made an ill-informed social judgment. Okay, so the negatives can be there as well. Alrighty, so that's basically what is the purpose, or what are the effects of social cognition. Okay, in the next one, we're looking at aspects of social cognition. So like I said before, social cognition is all about how we make social judgments. And so this idea of social judgments, of social cognition, kind of lends itself to three main concepts. And these will be, this will be the rest of the focus of chapter 9, okay? We're only going through one of them today, which is person perception. But just to give you an overview, person perception is one thing. Attribution, so how we kind of attribute behavior, what reasons we attribute to people behaving in a certain way, is another thing we'll be going through tomorrow. And attitudes and stereotypes we'll be going through next week, when we look at the role of people's attitudes in treating other people, things like stereotyping, things like discrimination, racism, all that stuff will be covered in the last part of this chapter 9. Today, we're just focusing on person perception. So what is person perception? A person perception, remember the word perception, okay? When we started unit 2, we started by looking at this word of, this term of sensation and perception. It's the same idea. Perception, no matter which chapter you look at it in, perception always means how we make sense or how we understand something, okay? So how we understand or make sense of something. Make sense of something, yeah. Okay, so if we look at the word then person perception is simply how we understand or make sense of people around us, okay? And the main way in which we make sense of people around us is by forming impressions. Okay? You might have heard about this famous saying that first impressions count, okay? Or a person's first impression is their last impression. Okay, these are famous sayings and a lot of us would have heard of this before. Okay, person perception, a big part of that understanding of how other people behave or our understanding of other people in our environment is to do with what impression we get of them when we first meet them. Okay, and first impressions do have a very powerful impact. It doesn't mean your impression of someone can't change. For example, when you first meet someone, if they're a little bit rude because of maybe some situation they're in, it doesn't mean that you'll go the rest of your life thinking that they're rude or judging them as being rude. But the first impression does become a powerful kind of memory of that person that you will always remember. Okay, so specifically, if we're going to define person perception in a little bit more depth, and this is the definition that, you know, I would really advise you guys to learn. The first definition is just a simple stating of that idea. Okay, so specifically person perception refers to the mental processes. Now we know about mental processes. We've learned this from all the way last year in transition week. Mental processes are about our thoughts, okay? Our ability to think, our ability to make judgments, our ability to make decisions. Okay, so the mental processes that we use to form impressions about other people. And when we draw impressions or when we form impressions about other people, it also leads us to conclude who that person is or what that person is like, okay? And usually when we make a conclusion about what a person is like, we're usually judging some element of their personal characteristics, which in other words could be referred to as their personality, okay? A lot of the time when you see someone behaving in a certain way, and you know, you make a social judgment of them or you use person perception, we often describe elements of that person's personality. So if you see someone being really loud, when you go outside, you'll be like, oh wow, they're really confident, or they're not very shy. Okay, so you kind of make some poke at their personality. Okay, and you might even mention good characteristics about that person. So if that person is really helping someone cross the road, or that person is really helping someone with their groceries, you might be like, okay, well, that person is very considerate, that person is very helpful, that person is very understanding, okay, or very kind. Okay, so we always kind of use adjectives that link to people's personal characteristics or their personalities. So that's the definition of person perception. And another example here, which is the example from the book, is that if someone is constantly losing their belongings and you see them every day, they're like, oh my God, I've lost my headphones again. Oh my God, I've lost my psych book again. Oh my God, I've lost my, my pencil case again. Okay, all this kind of stuff. You might actually judge them. Whether you judge them consciously, whether you judge them unconsciously, you might start to think that, okay, this person is being a little bit careless because it's not normal for someone to lose something every day of the week. Okay, and if they then ask you, hey, can I please borrow your Beats headphones? Or hey, can I please borrow your AirPods? You might actually be like, you know what, that is very valuable to me. And so I don't have AirPods obviously, but I think you guys tend to have those kinds of things. But so yeah, so if you guys like have that as a belonging, you might think twice about allowing them to borrow that particular item of yours, because you know that that's quite valuable. Or if you've got something that was very difficult for you to kind of obtain, like a limited edition comic, or a limited edition trying to think, limited edition stationery, I don't know, okay, something like that, you would then obviously think twice before allowing that person to borrow that from you, because your observation of them constantly losing things has caused you to make a judgment. First, it's caused you to think that, okay, this person is very careless. Then it's caused you to make a judgment of, okay, this person is constantly losing their things. And you've then made the decision that I'm not going to allow them to borrow my thing or my valuable item. Okay, so that's basically the mental processes behind why you don't allow that person to then borrow your headphones or something that's valuable to you. So person perception influences our judgments and influences our behavior. Okay, even though person perception is simply about the mental processes, it obviously influences our behavior. So in this case, I will say no to that person borrowing my valuable item that I have. Okay, cool. And obviously, because it influences our behavior, it influences how you eventually treat that person as well. Okay, so that's person perception. Now, we make impressions. Now, when we're making our impressions of other people, we tend to make impressions based on characteristics and behavior that we can observe. But, you know, as humans, we are quite superficial beings, and we do make impressions from physical appearance, even if it is a little bit controversial, even if it's something we don't want to admit. You know, none of us want to admit that, you know, we judge people by the way they look. Eventually, a big part of social psychology says that, yes, we do judge people by the way that they look, okay? And more than the way they look, like, you know, physically, we judge them from their physical appearance, okay? Not by their physical features always, but by their physical appearance, so how they present themselves. So if you look at the first picture here on the left-hand side, the yellow background one, the cartoony one, you've got two guys, and one of them is, you know, one of them is dressed in a very smart way, you know, wearing a polo, wearing some nice, you know, wearing some nice pants, wearing some good shoes. And so people are kind of like, you know, talking about him in a good way. And there's like a little picture of someone reading a book and looking quite educated next to him. And if we look at this person, we might think of this person as being quite educated. So we associate a positive quality with him. When we look at this guy, even though this guy might have done the same degree or have the same level of education as the guy he's standing next to, because he's dressed really sloppy, because you can see his shirt's quite worn out, you know, his jacket's not even properly on, it looks a bit oversized, he's wearing trackies, he's wearing, you know, it's like thongs, like it's not like, he doesn't look presentable. And for that reason, we would often associate a negative quality with this guy, okay? And there's a little picture of someone like reading into a book with a question mark, so showing that he's probably not educated, okay? So essentially what that picture says is that attractive people tend to be perceived as being smarter, funnier, and more likable than other people, okay? And so essentially attractive people are associated with more positive qualities for the simple fact that they are more attractive and that they look better and more presentable. Okay, so impressions from physical appearance is what that is all about. And one main kind of concept that we look at, and this is a really interesting concept, is this idea of the halo effect. Okay, the halo effect suggests that it's a cognitive bias, because it's basically a cognitive bias is a fault. Okay, it's a fault in the way that we think. So if I can write that down, fault in thinking. Okay, a cognitive bias is basically a faulty way of thinking, or a way of thinking that is not 100% accurate. So when we talk about a cognitive bias, essentially the halo effect is one example of that. So the halo effect is a cognitive bias in which the impression we form about one quality of a person, so I look at this guy and I'm like, yeah, he's pretty good looking, or he's pretty attractive, or he's pretty well presented, he looks very neat and clean and sharp. That impression that I make about that person influences my belief and expectations about the person in other qualities. So in terms of their personality or their actual characteristics of who they are. Okay, so by looking at this guy and seeing that he's presentable and that he's neat and he looks really sharp, I might make a judgment that, okay, he's probably organized in other points of his life. He's probably in some big leadership position at work. He's probably the kind of guy who's very considerate. Okay, so this is a faulty way of thinking, and all of us, we do go through the halo effect and we do experience this. Okay, if you look at the second picture here, and you'll notice this with a lot of those images going around social media, always at some point in time, where, you know, I think they call them the glow ups, of like a person who looks like not that great in maybe high school, and then they glow up and they become like really good looking, and out of nowhere they've just become like totally good looking. Okay, so essentially it's the same guy, but because he's removed his glasses, he's kind of like more clean shaven, maybe he's changed his hairstyle a bit, maybe he's lost a few kilos. Okay, all that stuff has now made him what we might say to be a conventionally attractive. Okay, conventionally attractive means what the majority of people would see as attractive. So we've got certain celebrities who, regardless of which culture you look at it from, they are seen as an attractive person. Okay, just conventionally attractive features, essentially. Okay, that most people would think are attractive or appealing. So the halo effect suggests that if I look at this guy, okay, I might make the social judgment. Okay, this guy is, you know, he seems like a bit of a dork, a bit of a nerd. I'm not really like, you know, not really like interested. You know, he doesn't look like he's very in touch with people. He probably doesn't have many friends. You know, we tend to make judgments like this just by looking at a picture like that. Whereas with this guy, we might say, okay, he looks very, you know, very organized. He looks like he would have a lot of friends. He looks like he would be, you know, quite a personable kind of person, okay, who's very, who is kind of like a happy-go-lucky person, you know, all that kind of stuff. So we tend to make more positive judgments about this guy because his physical appearance is a bit more appealing to us as compared to this guy. Even though they're the same person, because the physical appearance and the attractiveness is a little bit different across both photos, we might consider the more conventionally attractive person to be having better qualities, okay? Even though we know that's not always the case, we know that people who are conventionally attractive are not necessarily always good-hearted people or good people in terms of personalities, but that this is just what social psychology tells us. Okay, and this is what the halo effect is, that when you see someone who is physically attractive, they appear to you as though they've got a halo hanging over their heads, as though they're an angel, as though they could do no wrong. Okay, there's no wrong that they could possibly do. And this is why when a lot of people get into a relationship with someone who's like, I don't know, the biggest hunk on the, you know, the biggest hunk on the face of the universe or something like that, they don't see their personality flaws. They don't see the red flags that come up as to that person being manipulative or as to that person being a bad person. They only see the good things because they can't see past how you know, dreadfully attractive that person is. Okay, so research has also shown that when people are shown a conventionally attractive person, they will associate positive qualities to them. Okay, and this is essentially how we make impressions based on physical appearance. Okay, and then the last thing that we're looking at today is impressions from nonverbal communication. So although physical appearance plays a big role in how we make impressions or how we form judgments of other people, nonverbal communication is also important for how we make judgments. Okay, so nonverbal communication is referring to, if we talk about verbal communication, it's like referring to what we say. Okay, nonverbal communication, and I should put the non here because it's not on the same line. Okay, nonverbal communication is referring to what we don't say, okay, or what we say without opening our mouths, essentially. Okay, so what we don't say, or the non-verbal cues that we give out, things like our body language that help people to make a judgment of us. And body language is a huge part of non-verbal communication. Okay, and there are statistics that say a lot of how people judge us, like if you go to a job interview, you know, if you're trying to apply for a new school and you've got an interview there, a lot of how people judge us and how we judge others is not based on what that person says, but it's based on their body language, how they say that particular thing as well. So if someone comes up to you and they say something like, "Oh, that's a nice dress you've got on," that's like the use of their tone, or maybe the use of their eye gaze. Okay, they're kind of giving you that up and down kind of mean look, or, you know, the use of their gestures or the use of their bodily movements. That might give you an idea that this person doesn't actually think that my dress is nice, but they've just got something against me. Okay, the facial expressions that we give a person. If you're telling someone a story about yourself, that might be an embarrassing story, and that person is kind of snickering, or that person is kind of like giving you this kind of judgmental expression, or they're just like, they've got a blank face and they don't care at all about your story, then that might give you an idea that, you know what, next time I feel like talking to someone about something that's happened to me, I'm not going to choose this person because they just don't seem interested, or they seem a little bit judgmental. Okay, posture. Again, one of the reasons why posture is such a big thing and why parents are always going on about it is that your posture influences what kind of a person you look like or appear as. Okay, so if you've got kind of like a hunched, kind of stooped posture, people tend to judge you as being less confident, okay, and less of a go-getter, less of someone who's got like leadership qualities. Okay, gestures as well. So if you're someone who's pretty, pretty positive, or pretty, always trying to get the job done and always trying to make sure everything is all good, and you give someone a thumbs up, they might think that you're also an optimistic person, and that, you are a positive person. Okay, so these are just all examples. Essentially, this topic is pretty straightforward. We might ask you in a SAC situation, for example, to give an example of how a facial expression could influence a social judgment we make of another person. Again, it's just about picking any facial expression, and then connecting that to how it influences your social judgments. But yeah, essentially, like if you don't give eye contact to someone, that you might presume that that person is hiding something from you, that they don't want to look you in the eye. Okay, or that person, this might be their boss and they feel intimidated by that person. So rather than looking them in the eye, they look down. Now, there are exceptions to this, and we have to remember with facial expressions, for example, depending on which culture you come from, depending on what kind of culture you come from, certain facial expressions are actually either not looked upon like preferably, and some facial expressions are hidden. So I know in certain Asian cultures in school, it's actually rude for a child to look their teacher in the eye. And so if I were to go to a school in some Asian country and look the teacher in the eye, I might actually get like detention, or I might be interrogated that, why are you looking me in the eye? Don't look me in the eye. Okay, because children are supposed to show some level of fear and some level of intimidation towards their teacher. It's more out of respect, but it's just a cultural expectation. Similarly, what we might see as a thumbs up as being a good thing, a thumbs up in other cultures might actually be considered rude. Okay, so essentially we always have to be careful and understand that body language is not a universal thing, that body language in Australia will mean the same thing as body language I show in Japan or in India or in Brazil. It will be different depending on which culture you go into. And so that's why it is important a lot of the time to understand that there are cultural differences in body language, okay? And yeah, one more thing I forgot to mention this example. I just remembered it now. So just looking back at the impressions from physical appearance, it's not just about how you look in terms of your physical appearance, but even certain facial features. So for example, like people who have like baby faces, like more round faces with kind of full cheeks, they're actually seen to be more innocent and more friendly compared to people who have more kind of sharper faces with like higher jawlines and that kind of stuff. So to give you an example of someone who's got like a rounded kind of face, we could talk about like Selena Gomez. Okay, she's an example of a person who's got a rounded face. And so a lot of the time people might actually perceive her as being a lot more friendly, a lot more innocent, because she's got that kind of like babyish, she's still got that babyish face and that baby kind of appearance there. Okay, and obviously someone who has like a sharper face or a sharper jawline might be considered as being more dominant or being more of a leader kind of quality. Okay, so essentially we don't just make impressions based on physical appearance in terms of presentability, but even in terms of specific facial features as well. Okay, so that's essentially something I just wanted to add there. Alrighty, so that's basically it for today. Now the questions that you have to do, and I'll write them down on this slide because I think I haven't put a separate slide to write the questions. So today you're only doing 9.1. Okay, so 9.1 questions. Not many. 1, 4B, and 6. Okay, just 3 questions to do. And with that, I will stop the recording here.